I'm sitting in a wedding dress, but this isn't the wedding I spent months planning. My new husband leans over and whispers, "I told you he never deserved you." And I can't help but smile through my tears. In the back of the church, my ex-fiancé Jake stands with his best friend Marcus, both looking absolutely stunned. This is the wedding that happened exactly 1 year to the day after Jake cancelled our original ceremony to go to Vegas for Marcus's birthday party. Well, that's what he told me it was. Turns out there was a lot more to that story, and when I discovered the truth, I realised I'd been planning to marry the wrong brother all along. You're probably wondering how the hell I ended up here, marrying my ex-fiancé's brother. And trust me, a year ago, I would have thought this story was completely insane too. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Sarah, and 4 years ago I thought I'd hit the relationship jackpot when I met Jake Miller at a mutual friend's housewarming party. He was magnetic in that effortless way some people just are. The guy who could walk into any room and immediately become the centre of attention without even trying. I was 26, working as a marketing coordinator, living in a studio apartment that I'd organised to within an inch of its life, with colour-coded calendars and meal prep Sundays. Jake was the complete opposite. Spontaneous, charming, the type who made decisions based entirely on what sounded fun in the moment. At first, I found this refreshing. I'd spent my whole life being the responsible one, and Jake made me feel like I could be spontaneous too. But here's where things get complicated. Jake's best friend Marcus had been in his life since middle school, and their friendship was intense. I'm talking daily phone calls, weekly hangout sessions, and Marcus having an opinion about literally everything in Jake's life, including me. What I didn't realise was that I was essentially dating both Jake and Marcus, except Marcus got veto power, and I got to do all the emotional labour. If Marcus wanted to do something, Jake's entire schedule would rearrange itself around that. If Marcus didn't like a restaurant I'd picked for dinner, suddenly Jake would discover he wasn't really in the mood for that kind of food. I made excuses for this dynamic because I loved Jake, and I genuinely believed that his loyalty to his best friend was just another admirable quality in a man I was planning to marry. I told myself I was being mature by not getting jealous of a friendship. I was being the cool girlfriend who understood that men need their bros. Looking back, I realised I was just being the accommodating girlfriend who had been trained her whole life to make herself smaller so other people could feel bigger. We'd been together for 4 years, engaged for 1, and I was the planner, the organiser, the one who handled all the boring adult stuff while Jake got to be the fun, carefree guy everyone loved. Then there was David. David Miller was Jake's older brother by 3 years, and if Jake was a firework, David was a steady flame. Where Jake was all flash and spontaneity, David was the guy who showed up early, stayed late, and remembered your birthday without needing Facebook to remind him. Honestly, when I first met David at a family barbecue about 6 months into dating Jake, I barely registered him. He was polite, asked thoughtful questions about my job, and helped clear dishes without being asked. But next to Jake's magnetic personality, David seemed almost invisible. I'm ashamed to admit it now, but I mentally categorised him as Jake's boring older brother, and didn't give him much thought beyond that. David worked as an accountant, lived in the same modest house he'd bought 5 years earlier, and drove a sensible sedan that he maintained religiously. While Jake was telling animated stories that had the whole family laughing, David was quietly making sure everyone had drinks and that his elderly aunt had someone to talk to. I thought this made him forgettable. What I didn't realise was that David was watching everything, including how his brother treated me. While Jake would interrupt me mid-sentence or forget to introduce me to people at family gatherings, David would always make a point to include me in conversations and remember details from things I'd mentioned months earlier. When Jake would show up 30 minutes late to family dinners without calling, David would quietly text me to make sure I knew where to park, and that there was a vegetarian option, since Jake had forgotten to mention my dietary restrictions. At the time, I appreciated David's kindness, but saw it as just basic politeness. I didn't understand that he was actually demonstrating what consideration looked like, something that was glaringly absent from my relationship with his brother. David never said anything directly critical about Jake. Family loyalty ran deep in the Miller household. But there were moments when I'd catch him watching Jake dismiss something I'd said, or prioritise Marcus over me. And I'd see this subtle tightening around his eyes. It was like he wanted to say something but held himself back. I wish I'd paid more attention to those moments. Because David was seeing things clearly long before I was ready to admit there was anything wrong with my relationship with Jake. Wedding planning should have been our time to dream together and make decisions as a team, but instead, it became a solo project with my name on it and Jake's name on the credit. When we got engaged, Jake was initially excited, posting photos of my ring and talking about our big day. But as soon as the actual work started, he seemed to develop a sudden allergy to anything wedding-related. I'd schedule appointments to taste cakes, and Jake would cancel last minute because Marcus needed help moving furniture. I'd book venue tours, and Jake would show up 20 minutes late because he and Marcus had gotten distracted playing video games. When it came time to choose between two photographers, Jake told me to just pick whichever one you like better, because he was planning Marcus's fantasy football draft party and couldn't focus on boring wedding stuff. I found myself making excuses to vendors about why my fiancé wasn't there. He's so busy with work. He trusts my judgment completely. He's not really a details person. The worst part was dress shopping. My mum, my sister, and my best friend all took time off work to come with me to this huge milestone moment, and Jake was supposed to meet us afterward for lunch to hear about the experience. He never showed up. Marcus had gotten tickets to some last-minute baseball game, and Jake chose that over celebrating the fact that I'd found my dream dress. When I called him, hurt and embarrassed in front of my family, he said I was being dramatic, and that the wedding isn't for another year, so what's the rush? I spent the entire lunch making excuses for him, while my mum gave me these concerned looks she thought I couldn't see. The pattern was so consistent it became predictable. I would handle every single wedding decision, from choosing the flowers to booking the band to addressing invitations. And then Jake would swoop in at family gatherings to accept congratulations for planning such a beautiful wedding. People would praise him for being such a lucky guy to have someone who had everything so perfectly organised. And he'd beam like he'd contributed anything beyond showing up to get fitted for a tux, which, by the way, I had to reschedule 3 times because of various Marcus emergencies. 3 weeks before our wedding, something shifted in Jake. And I couldn't put my finger on what it was, but it felt like he was slowly disappearing right in front of me. He'd always been attached to his phone, but suddenly he was guarding it like it contained state secrets. He'd get texts and immediately flip the phone face down, or step into another room to take calls that he claimed were work stuff, even though it was 10 at night on a Sunday. When I'd walk into a room, he'd quickly close whatever he was looking at on his laptop and give me this fake, bright smile that didn't reach his eyes. The worst part was when he cancelled our final venue walkthrough. You know, the one where we were supposed to confirm the table arrangements and go over the timeline with our coordinator one last time. He called me 2 hours before we were supposed to leave and said Marcus was having some kind of family emergency and needed Jake to drive him somewhere. When I asked what was wrong, Jake got defensive and snappy, saying I was being nosy and that some things are private. I had to call our wedding coordinator and reschedule, making yet another excuse for my absent fiancé while secretly wondering what kind of emergency required Jake specifically and couldn't wait 3 hours. But the moment that really scared me was when I brought up our honeymoon plans. We'd booked a trip to Italy months earlier, and I was trying to finalise our dinner reservations and day trip bookings since we were leaving 2 days after the wedding. Jake's response was to snap at me like I'd asked him to donate a kidney. Can we just figure that out later? God, Sarah, you're always planning everything to death. Can't anything just be spontaneous? When I pointed out that we were literally leaving for Italy in less than a month, and that spontaneous wasn't really an option for international travel, he stormed out of the room muttering something about me being impossible to please. I stood there in our kitchen, holding a guidebook and feeling like I was talking to a stranger. This was the man who'd proposed to me, who'd spent months telling everyone how excited he was to marry me, and suddenly he couldn't even discuss our honeymoon without acting like I was torturing him. 2 weeks before the wedding, I ran into Marcus at the grocery store, and what should have been a casual 5-minute conversation turned into the moment everything started unravelling. We were making small talk in the cereal aisle when he casually mentioned something about his birthday party plans, and I made some polite comment about hoping he had a great celebration. That's when Marcus gave me this weird look and said, "Oh, you know, it's the same weekend as your wedding, right? Jake didn't tell you?" My blood went cold, but I managed to keep smiling and said something vague like, "Oh, right, of course," while my brain was screaming. Marcus continued talking, completely oblivious to the fact that he'd just dropped a bomb on me, saying things like, "Yeah, it's such bad timing, but you know how these things go, and I'm sure Jake mentioned something to you about the conflict." The way he said conflict made my stomach drop, like this was some kind of established problem that I should already know about. I mumbled something about needing to get going and practically ran to my car, my hands shaking as I tried to process what had just happened. Jake's best friend was having a birthday party the same weekend as our wedding, and not only had Jake never mentioned this to me, but Marcus seemed to think there was some kind of conflict that needed resolving. I sat in my car in the parking lot, staring at my phone and trying to figure out how to even bring this up with Jake, without sounding like I was accusing him of something. But the more I thought about it, the more I realised that Jake's recent weird behaviour, his secretiveness, his irritation about wedding planning, it was all starting to make a horrible kind of sense. I drove home with this growing dread in my stomach, knowing that when I confronted Jake about this, I wasn't going to like what I heard. And the scariest part was that Marcus had seemed genuinely surprised that I didn't already know about his party, like he assumed Jake would have discussed this conflict with his fiancé. What kind of conflict could there possibly be between a birthday party and a wedding that had been planned for over a year? When I got home that evening, I tried to approach the conversation casually, but my heart was pounding like I was about to defuse a bomb. I waited until Jake was relaxed on the couch, then sat down next to him and said, "Hey, I ran into Marcus today and he mentioned his birthday party is the same weekend as our wedding. I didn't realise the dates overlapped." Jake's entire body language changed instantly. His shoulders tensed. He stopped looking at me, and he got that defensive tone he always used when he was caught in something he didn't want to explain. "So what? People have birthdays, Sarah? It's not like he planned it to spite you or something." I tried to stay calm and said, "I'm not upset about when his birthday is. I just didn't know there was a party planned, and Marcus seemed to think you two had discussed some kind of conflict about it." That's when Jake really lost it. He stood up from the couch and started pacing around our living room, saying things like, "You're being so dramatic about this," and "Why are you always trying to control everything I do?" When I pointed out that I wasn't trying to control anything, I just wanted to understand what was going on, he accused me of interrogating him and said I was being paranoid and jealous of his friendship with Marcus. The conversation went in circles for 20 minutes, with Jake deflecting every direct question I asked. When I finally said, "Okay, so you'll be at our wedding, right? Not at Marcus's party?" Jake's response was infuriating. He said, "Of course I'll be at our wedding, God! What kind of question is that?" But when I pressed him and said, "So you're telling Marcus you can't go to his party because it's our wedding day?" Jake got even more agitated and said, "I never said I was going to his party instead of our wedding. You're putting words in my mouth." Notice how he never actually answered the question. He just kept insisting that I was being unreasonable for even asking, like wanting clarity about whether my fiancé would show up to our wedding was some kind of outrageous demand. The whole conversation left me feeling crazy. Like I was the one being unreasonable for wanting my future husband to prioritise our wedding over his best friend's birthday party. The following Sunday, we had dinner at Jake's parents' house, and I was still feeling unsettled from our conversation about Marcus's party when David pulled me aside in the kitchen while Jake was outside grilling with his dad. David was loading dishes into the dishwasher, and without even looking up, he said quietly, "Sarah, can I ask you something? Is everything okay with Jake lately?" I was so surprised that someone else had noticed something was off that I almost started crying, right there next to the dirty plates. David continued, "I've been watching him tonight, and he's been avoiding any mention of the wedding. Mum brought up the rehearsal dinner twice, and both times Jake changed the subject immediately. Dad asked him about the honeymoon, and Jake just mumbled something about 'we'll see' and walked away." David finally looked at me directly, and his expression was more serious than I'd ever seen it. "Look, I don't want to overstep, and I know Jake's my brother, but something feels very, very wrong here. In the past month, every time someone brings up your wedding, Jake either leaves the room or starts talking about something completely different. That's not normal behaviour for someone who's supposed to be getting married in less than 2 weeks." I felt this huge wave of relief that I wasn't going crazy, that someone else had noticed what I was seeing. David dried his hands on a dish towel and said, "I don't know what's going on, but I've never seen Jake act like this about anything important in his life. Usually when he's excited about something, you can't shut him up about it. But with your wedding, it's like he's pretending it's not happening." He paused, then added, "I'm probably out of line saying this, but if I were you, I'd want to know what he's really thinking before you walk down that aisle. Because from where I'm standing, it doesn't look like he's thinking about the wedding at all." 5 days before our wedding, Jake came home from work with this weird energy. Not nervous or apologetic, but almost excited, like he was about to share good news. I was in the kitchen finalising our catering head count when he walked in, took a deep breath and said, "Sarah, we need to talk about the wedding. I think we should postpone it." I literally stopped breathing for a moment. Sure, I'd misheard him, but Jake kept talking like he was discussing what to have for dinner. Marcus planned this incredible birthday trip to Vegas for next weekend. It's going to be this whole big celebration with all his college friends flying in, and it's basically a once-in-a-lifetime thing. He's been planning it for months, and I can't let my best friend down by missing it. I stood there holding our final guest count, staring at this man I thought I knew, trying to process what he was saying. When I finally found my voice, I asked, "Are you telling me you want to cancel our wedding to go to Vegas for Marcus's birthday?" Jake immediately got defensive and said, "I'm not cancelling it, I'm postponing it. There's a difference. We can reschedule for next month or something." The casual way he said, "next month or something," like our wedding was a dentist appointment that could just be moved around, made me feel physically sick. I asked him if he understood that we had 200 guests coming, that we'd lose thousands of dollars in deposits, that my dress alterations were done, that people had taken time off work and booked hotels. Jake's response was to shrug and say, "Yeah, it sucks about the money, but Marcus has been my best friend since we were kids. This is important to him." When I pointed out that our wedding was supposed to be important to him too, he said, "Of course it is, but we can get married any time. This Vegas thing is a specific event that I can't miss." The way he said "we can get married any time," like it was just some random thing we'd eventually get around to, was the moment I realised that this man had never actually wanted to marry me. He wanted the idea of getting married, the attention and congratulations, but not the actual commitment or partnership that came with it. The next few days were the worst of my life, and Jake acted like I was having some kind of irrational breakdown over a minor inconvenience. While I was crying and trying to figure out how to tell my parents that their daughter's wedding was off, Jake was in our bedroom packing for Vegas and humming. Actually humming. When I asked him to help me call the vendors to cancel everything, he said, I'm really busy getting ready for this trip. And honestly, you're better at handling that kind of stuff anyway. When I started crying again, he had the audacity to tell me I was being too emotional and that it's not like someone died. The worst part was how excited he seemed about Vegas. He kept getting texts from Marcus and the other guys about their plans, and I could see him smiling and typing back enthusiastically while I was on the phone with our florist, trying to explain why we wouldn't need $300 worth of centerpieces anymore. I had to call our photographer, our DJ, our caterer, the venue coordinator, and every single member of our wedding party to tell them the wedding was off. I had to call my boss to explain why I suddenly didn't need the time off I'd requested. I had to call Jake's grandmother to break the news before she showed up at the church on Saturday morning. Each conversation was humiliating and heartbreaking, especially when people asked what happened, and I had to explain that my fiancé chose his best friend's birthday party over our wedding. Jake left for Vegas on Thursday morning, the day before what was supposed to be our rehearsal dinner, and his goodbye was a casual see you Sunday, like he was going to a work conference. He didn't help with a single cancellation call. He didn't comfort me when I cried. He didn't seem to feel any guilt or sadness about what we were losing. If anything, he seemed relieved, like some huge burden had been lifted off his shoulders. I spent Thursday night alone in our apartment, surrounded by wedding gifts that needed to be returned and a dress hanging in our closet that I'd never get to wear, finally understanding that Jake had never wanted to marry me. He'd just gotten caught up in the idea of a wedding and panicked when it became real. On Friday afternoon, while I was sitting on my living room floor, surrounded by wedding gifts and a list of vendor phone numbers, there was a knock at my door. I expected it to be my mum or my sister coming to check on me, but when I opened it, David was standing there with coffee and a box of tissues, looking absolutely furious in a way I'd never seen before. "I heard what Jake did," he said, and his voice was tight with anger. "I came to help with whatever you need." I started crying again, just from the kindness of it, and David stepped inside, took one look at the chaos of my apartment, and immediately rolled up his sleeves. For the next 6 hours, David helped me make cancellation calls, and I watched him handle vendors with a professionalism and courtesy that Jake had never shown to anyone in the service industry. When our caterer tried to keep our entire deposit despite the last-minute cancellation, David calmly negotiated until they agreed to refund half of it. When our DJ was rude about the inconvenience, David firmly but politely reminded him that we were dealing with a family emergency and asked for his compassion. He organised all the wedding gifts into categories for returning, helped me draft a message to send to our wedding guests, and even called his own parents to explain the situation so I wouldn't have to face that conversation alone. But what struck me most was how angry David was on my behalf. At one point, while we were boxing up crystal vases, he said, "I'm so ashamed of my brother right now. What he did to you is unforgivable, and I need you to know that this isn't about you not being good enough. This is about Jake being too immature and selfish to recognise what he had." David stayed until almost midnight, and when he finally got ready to leave, he turned to me and said, "Jake is going to come back from Vegas expecting you to just forgive him and move on like nothing happened. Please don't let him convince you that this is normal or okay, because it's not." For the first time in days, I felt like someone was actually on my side. Someone who understood that what Jake had done wasn't just an unfortunate scheduling conflict, but a fundamental betrayal of everything a partnership should be. Saturday night, what should have been my wedding night, I was stress-eating ice cream and mindlessly scrolling through Instagram when I saw a story that made my blood turn to ice. It was posted by one of Marcus's college friends, and the caption read, "Best bachelor party ever. Can't believe Marcus kept this engagement secret for 6 months." The video showed Marcus and Jake at some upscale Vegas restaurant, both wearing matching groom and best man t-shirts, with Marcus holding up a champagne flute and Jake giving a speech about brotherhood and loyalty. I watched it 3 times before the full horror of what I was seeing sank in. This wasn't Marcus's birthday party. This was Marcus's bachelor party. Marcus was engaged, had been engaged for 6 months, and Jake was his best man. Jake had known about this the entire time and had lied to my face about what the Vegas trip actually was. I started frantically checking other social media accounts, and the evidence was everywhere. Photos of the guys at a strip club with Marcus's last weekend of freedom banners. Videos of them at a poker table with Jake, organising some kind of best man speech competition. Pictures of Marcus wearing a future husband sash, while Jake stood next to him grinning like an idiot. The timeline made me physically sick. Marcus had gotten engaged 6 months ago, which meant Jake knew about the bachelor party when we sent out our save the dates. He knew about it when we booked our venue. He knew about it when I was trying on wedding dresses and crying because he wasn't there to support me. Jake hadn't just chosen his best friend's birthday over our wedding. He had chosen to be Marcus's best man instead of being my husband, and he had lied about it for months. Every excuse he'd made, every time he'd called me dramatic for asking questions, every moment he'd made me feel crazy for sensing that something was wrong. It was all because he was hiding the fact that he'd already committed to being in someone else's wedding on our wedding day. The betrayal was so complete and so calculated that I actually laughed, this bitter, hysterical laugh that scared me a little. I had been planning a wedding with a man who was secretly planning to be in a different wedding the same weekend. And he had the nerve to act like I was being unreasonable when I found out about the conflict. Jake came home Sunday night, acting like he'd just returned from a normal business trip, walking through the door with his Vegas tan and a, "Hey babe, did you miss me?" like our entire relationship hadn't just imploded. When I confronted him with the Instagram posts and videos from Marcus's bachelor party, Jake's reaction was to immediately go on the offensive and accuse me of stalking his social media and trying to spy on his private time with his friends. He actually had the nerve to say, "It's really creepy that you're screenshotting my friend's posts, Sarah. That's not normal behaviour." When I pointed out that he'd lied to me for months about what the Vegas trip actually was, Jake rolled his eyes and said, "I never lied to you. I said it was Marcus's birthday celebration." And it was. His birthday happens to be the same weekend as his bachelor party. I didn't think I needed to give you a minute-by-minute itinerary. The gaslighting was so blatant it was almost impressive. When I asked him why he couldn't have just told me the truth about being Marcus's best man, Jake said, "Because I knew you'd react exactly like this, all dramatic and jealous. You wouldn't understand the kind of loyalty Marcus and I have. We've been best friends since we were 12 years old. That bond is sacred." When I said, "What about the bond we're supposed to have as husband and wife?" Jake actually laughed and said, "We're not husband and wife yet, are we? And honestly, after seeing how you've handled this whole situation, I'm starting to wonder if you're mature enough for marriage." The way he turned my completely reasonable anger about his deception into evidence that I was somehow deficient as a partner was breathtaking in its cruelty. Jake spent the next hour explaining to me how marriages come and go, but friendships like his with Marcus are once in a lifetime, and how if I really loved him, I would understand that his loyalty to Marcus had to come first. He actually expected me to apologise for being upset that he'd chosen another man's wedding over ours, and then lied about it for months. After Jake finished his speech about loyalty and sacred friendships, he actually sat down at our kitchen table and said, "Okay, so now that we've cleared the air about this whole misunderstanding, when do you want to reschedule the wedding? I'm thinking maybe October would be nice. Fall colours, cooler weather, less expensive since it's not peak wedding season." I stared at him in complete disbelief, realising that in Jake's mind, we'd just had a minor disagreement that could be solved by picking a new date and moving on. When I told him I wasn't interested in rescheduling anything until we dealt with the fundamental issues in our relationship, Jake's expression shifted from confused to annoyed. "What fundamental issues? Sarah, you're making this into a way bigger deal than it needs to be. Marcus is married now, so there won't be any more conflicts. We can have our wedding and everyone wins." When I explained that the problem wasn't the scheduling conflict, but the months of lying, The prioritizing of Marcus over me, and the complete lack of respect for our relationship. Jake got that condescending tone he always used when he thought I was being irrational. He said, "You're being really selfish right now. Family is supposed to be understanding and supportive, not vindictive. I made one mistake and you're acting like I cheated on you or something." The word family hit me like a slap because it crystallized everything that was wrong with Jake's perspective. He expected me to give him unconditional understanding and support like a family member, but he'd never extended that same consideration to me. When I told him that our relationship was supposed to be a partnership where we both prioritized each other, not a hierarchy where I always came second to Marcus, Jake actually rolled his eyes and said, "God, you're so needy. Why does everything have to be about you? Can't you just be happy that I want to marry you at all?" That's when it hit me like a freight train. Jake didn't want to marry me because he loved me or saw me as his life partner. He wanted to marry me because I was convenient, because I handled all the boring parts of adult life for him, because I made his life easier without asking for much in return. I had been planning a future with someone who saw me as a supporting character in his own story, not as an equal partner in building something together. After I told Jake I needed time to think about our relationship, he moved back in with his parents temporarily, and David became my unexpected lifeline during the most difficult period of my life. It started innocently enough. David would text to check on me, bring me groceries when I was too depressed to leave the apartment, and help me navigate the complicated process of untangling a shared life with his brother. But somewhere between David helping me change my lease to remove Jake's name and him showing up with soup when I had the flu, I started noticing things about him that I'd been blind to for 4 years. David remembered that I liked my coffee with oat milk, not regular milk. He actually listened when I talked about my job and would follow up days later asking how that difficult project went. When I mentioned wanting to try a new hiking trail, David researched the best routes and offered to go with me for safety. These weren't grand romantic gestures. They were simple acts of consideration that Jake had never shown me in 4 years together. David treated me like my thoughts and feelings mattered, like my time was valuable, like I was a person worthy of effort and attention. We started spending more time together, and I found myself looking forward to our conversations in a way that surprised me. David was funny in this quiet, observant way that I'd never appreciated before. He had opinions about books and movies and politics that went deeper than surface level. He asked me questions about my dreams, and actually seemed interested in the answers. One evening, after we'd spent 3 hours talking on my couch about everything from our childhood fears to our career goals, David looked at me and said, "You know, I always wondered what Jake was thinking. Taking you for granted the way he did. If I had someone like you in my life, I'd never stop trying to deserve you." That's when I realized that what I was feeling wasn't just gratitude for David's kindness during a difficult time. It was genuine romantic attraction to a man who saw me as an equal partner worth investing in. For the first time in my adult life, I understood what it felt like to be truly valued by someone, and it was intoxicating. 3 months after David and I started dating, Jake found out about our relationship through a mutual friend and suddenly decided he wanted to fight for our love. You know, the same love he'd casually thrown away for a Vegas bachelor party. Jake showed up at my apartment, unannounced with flowers, and this whole speech about how he'd had time to think and realized he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. He promised he'd changed, that he understood now how much I meant to him, and that if I gave him another chance, he'd prove that I was his priority. When I told him I was happy with David and that we were over, Jake's mask slipped completely, and he started screaming about how David had stolen his fiancé and manipulated me while I was vulnerable, according to Jake. David had orchestrated our entire relationship as some kind of revenge plot against his brother, because apparently, in Jake's mind, I couldn't possibly have chosen David on my own merit. Jake actually said, "He's been waiting for years to swoop in and take what's mine, and you're too naive to see it." When I pointed out that I wasn't anyone's property to be stolen, Jake pivoted to emotional manipulation, crying about how our family was being destroyed, and how could I do this to him with his own brother. The real explosion came when Jake took his victim narrative to his parents, painting himself as the heartbroken fiancé whose brother had betrayed him by seducing his girlfriend during a vulnerable time. Jake conveniently left out the part about cancelling our wedding for another man's bachelor party, instead telling everyone that we'd had a small disagreement about timing and that David had taken advantage of our temporary break. For a hot minute, Jake's parents bought into his version of events and were cold to both David and me at family gatherings. But David, being the stand-up guy he is, sat down with his parents and calmly explained the truth about what Jake had done, showing them the social media posts from Marcus's bachelor party and the timeline of events. Watching Jake's carefully constructed victim narrative crumble when faced with actual facts was deeply satisfying, especially when his own mother looked at him and said, "Jacob, you chose another man's wedding over your own. How did you expect this to end?" Initially, Jake's parents rallied around their younger son because his version of events made him sound like the victim of a cruel betrayal rather than the architect of his own relationship's destruction. Jake's mother actually called me to say she was disappointed in my decision to give up on the relationship so easily, and that she thought I should have been more understanding about Jake needing to support his best friend during an important time in Marcus's life. She suggested that real love meant working through difficulties rather than running to someone else the moment things get hard, which was rich considering her son had literally run to Vegas the moment our relationship required actual commitment. Jake's father was less direct, but made pointed comments at family gatherings about loyalty and forgiveness that were clearly aimed at me and David. For about a month, family dinners were incredibly awkward, with Jake basking in his parents' sympathy, while David and I were treated like we'd committed some kind of moral crime against family unity. But then David's aunt, who had been following the whole drama, asked some pointed questions about the timeline of events, and Jake's story started falling apart under scrutiny. When Jake's mother learned that Marcus had been engaged for 6 months before our wedding date, she started asking why Jake hadn't mentioned this important detail earlier. When she found out that Jake had been Marcus's best man in a full wedding ceremony, the same day he was supposed to marry me, her tune changed completely. The final straw came when Jake's father discovered that Jake had spent over $3,000 on Marcus's bachelor party, money that came from the wedding fund Jake and I had been building together, while telling me we needed to cut costs on our own celebration. Suddenly, Jake's parents were asking much harder questions about their son's priorities and decision-making, and Jake's attempts to paint himself as the misunderstood victim started looking pathetic rather than sympathetic. Jake's mother eventually pulled me aside and apologized, saying she'd been seeing this situation through mother's eyes rather than woman's eyes, and that she was starting to understand that Jake's pattern of putting Marcus before everyone else, including his own fiancé, was deeply problematic and not something any woman should have to tolerate. Exactly 1 year after Jake cancelled our wedding, David and I were having a quiet dinner at home, when he got up to clear the dishes and said, "Sarah, I have something I want to ask you, and I need you to know that there's no pressure and no timeline here. I just want you to know how I feel." He sat back down across from me, took my hands and said, "This past year with you has shown me what partnership actually looks like, and I can't imagine building a life with anyone else. I love how you laugh at terrible movies. I love how you remember everyone's birthdays. I love how you never give up on the people you care about, even when they don't deserve it. I love your strength and your kindness, and the way you make me want to be a better person every single day." Then David pulled out a simple, elegant ring. Nothing flashy or designed for Instagram, just beautiful and perfectly suited to who I actually am, and said, "I know the idea of marriage might be complicated for you after everything you've been through, and we can take as much time as you need, but I want you to know that if you'll have me, I promise to show up for you every single day, to prioritize our relationship above everything else, and to never make you question whether you matter to me." It was everything Jake's proposal hadn't been: quiet, sincere, and entirely focused on our relationship, rather than the performance of romance. When I said yes, David's face lit up with this pure joy that made me realise I'd never seen Jake look at me that way, not even when he'd proposed. We talked for hours about what we wanted our marriage to look like, and when David suggested we could get married on the anniversary of my cancelled wedding, I knew it was perfect. "Let's reclaim that date," he said. "Turn it from the worst day of your life into the best one." The idea of marrying David on the exact day Jake had chosen Marcus over me felt like poetic justice. Proof that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you clears the path for the best thing that could ever happen to you. Our wedding day was absolutely perfect, and the fact that it was in the exact same venue where Jake was supposed to marry me made it even more meaningful, like we were erasing his betrayal and replacing it with something real and beautiful. David and I had planned everything together this time, from the flowers, to the music, to the menu. And it felt like a true partnership rather than a solo project. When I walked down the aisle and saw David waiting for me, his face was radiant with this genuine joy and love that took my breath away. During our ceremony, I kept thinking about how different this felt from what my wedding to Jake would have been. There was no anxiety, no wondering if the groom actually wanted to be there, no Marcus lurking in the background ready to derail everything. Just two people who were absolutely certain they wanted to build a life together. But the real vindication came when Jake and Marcus showed up during our cocktail hour, apparently thinking they could cause some kind of dramatic scene. I saw them through the window, both dressed up like they were going to a club rather than a wedding, and Jake had this smug expression like he was about to prove some kind of point. When they walked into our reception, the entire room went quiet, and I watched Jake's face change as he took in the scene. Me laughing with my new husband, our families mingling happily, everyone celebrating a love that was genuine and healthy and built on mutual respect. David immediately came to stand beside me, not possessive or aggressive, just supportive, and said quietly, "Do you want me to ask them to leave?" But I realised I didn't need them to leave because seeing Jake's face as he watched me be genuinely happy with someone who actually valued me was the most satisfying thing I'd ever experienced. Jake looked around at our wedding. The same flowers, the same venue, many of the same guests who would have been at our wedding. And you could see him realising that this was what our day could have been if he'd been capable of putting me first. Marcus actually tried to get Jake to leave, clearly uncomfortable with how pathetic they both looked. But Jake stood there for almost 10 minutes watching David and me dance, and I could see in his eyes that he finally understood what he'd thrown away. Looking back on everything now, 2 years into my marriage with David, I can honestly say that Jake cancelling our wedding was the best thing that ever happened to me, even though it felt like the worst thing at the time. My life with David is everything. My life with Jake never could have been. We make decisions together, we prioritise each other, and I never have to wonder if I'm competing with his best friend for his attention and loyalty. David remembers our anniversaries, shows up when he says he will, and treats our relationship like the sacred partnership it's supposed to be. When I think about what my life would have looked like if I'd actually married Jake, I get physically sick, imagining myself 10 years from now, still making excuses for his behaviour, still coming second to Marcus, still doing all the emotional labour while Jake got all the credit. I would have spent my marriage being the understanding wife, who never complained when her husband chose his best friend over their family vacation, their anniversary dinner, or their children's school events. I've learnt to recognise my own worth now, and I've gotten really good at setting boundaries with people who try to take advantage of my naturally accommodating personality. I don't make myself smaller anymore, so other people can feel bigger, and I don't apologise for expecting basic respect and consideration from the people in my life. The funniest part is that Jake still occasionally tries to reach out, usually when he's had a few drinks, sending me messages about how I ruined our family by choosing David over him. But here's the thing, Jake never wanted a family with me. He wanted a personal assistant who would also sleep with him and never complain about being treated like an afterthought. David wanted a wife, a partner, an equal, and that's exactly what he got. So tell me, did I go too far by marrying my ex-fiancé's brother, or should I have done it sooner? Because honestly, I think David and I wasted too much time pretending Jake was ever worthy of either of our loyalty. Let me know in the comments what you think, because I'm curious if you would have handled this situation differently than I did.